Good evening and welcome back. If tonight finds you already settled somewhere warm, a blanket pulled close, a light dimmed low, then you're exactly where you need to be. I'm glad you're here. There's a particular kind of history I want to sit with you tonight. One that doesn't live in textbooks or museum placards, but in the calloused hands and quiet instincts of people who had almost nothing standing between them and the cold, dark wilderness except what they knew. Here is what's at stake tonight. Imagine waking in total darkness, hundreds of miles from another living soul who speaks your language with no matches, no map, no way to call for help if something goes wrong. Your survival depends entirely on knowledge that exists nowhere, written down knowledge carried only in memory passed hand to hand, skill to skill, from person to person, because writing it down was never the point. Living it was. Tonight we're going to explore the forgotten skills that kept frontiersmen alive in one of the most unforgiving environments North America ever offered, and we're going to understand why so many of those skills, brilliant as they were, simply vanished from human memory within a single lifetime. Let me bring you into one particular morning first, because history is always easier to hold when it has a face attached to it. It's October of 1831, somewhere in the folded valleys of the Rocky Mountains. A young trapper new to this life lies awake before dawn listening. He's been in the mountains only a few months, sent west by a fur company that needed bodies willing to risk the wilderness for beaver pelts. And he still carries the soft hands of a city upbringing, though they are beginning to callous. Beside him, an older man stirs the coals of a nearly dead fire back to life without a single wasted motion, the kind of economy that only comes from doing something 10,000 times. The younger man's stomach aches with hunger, his muscles ache from yesterday's climb, and somewhere in the trees beyond their camp a twig snaps that shouldn't have. The older man goes still, not afraid exactly, but attentive in a way the younger man hasn't learned yet. A stillness that reads the forest, the way a person might read a familiar face for a flicker of concern. He doesn't reach for his rifle. He reaches instead for a small pouch of glass trade beads, because he already understands before either of them can see anything that whatever is approaching through those trees will be met with negotiation long before it's met with gunpowder. That instinct, the choice to recognize a threat correctly and respond with the right kind of calm, was itself a survival skill, every bit as essential as fire or shelter, and it took years in this country to earn. That single morning holds nearly everything this story is about. A person far from the comforts of home, carrying not modern equipment but earned knowledge. A landscape that offered no mercy for mistakes, and a quiet, unglamorous competence that meant the difference between another sunrise and no sunrise at all. So how does a person come to know a wilderness that intimately? How does anyone learn to read footprints in mud well enough to tell how many hours old they are, or shape a garment from a raw animal? Hide using nothing but a knife, some brains and patience, or build a boat from willow branches and skin when the only way across a flooding river is through it? These are the questions we're going to sit with tonight, and I think you'll find, as I did researching this, that the answers are far more remarkable and far more human than the rugged frontier myth usually allows. Before we go further into that world, I want to pause for just a moment. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, quiet, honest, told without rushing, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might be looking for exactly this on a night like tonight. And if you have a moment, I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what drew you to this story tonight. I read every one, and it means more than you might think to know who's out there in the dark with me. Now let's get comfortable and let's begin. To understand the mountain man and the frontier trapper properly, we have to step back from the romantic image, the buckskin-clad hero riding into golden sunsets that so many paintings and dime novels love to sell. The reality was slower, harder, and far more interesting. These were largely ordinary men, often barely out of their teenage years, drawn west in the early decades of the 1800s by a fur trade that had turned beaver pelts into something close to currency. A single company might send dozens of trappers into unmapped territory, each spring, men who would not see another white face, sometimes not another human face of any kind, for 8 months or more. What kept them alive during that stretch of time was not courage, though. Courage certainly helped. What kept them alive was a body of practical knowledge, so specific, so hard-won, and so deeply tied to a particular place and a particular way of living that almost none of it survives intact today. Consider for a moment what it actually meant to have no calendar and no clock. Time on the frontier was measured by daylight, by the position of the sun sliding across a ridgeline, by the slow turning of seasons rather than the ticking of hours. A trapper didn't ask what day of the week it was. He asked whether the beaver were still moving before the first snow, whether the river was low enough to cross safely, whether there was enough light left to finish building shelter before the temperature dropped. This was a different relationship with time altogether, one built entirely around what the land was doing, not what a schedule demanded. And consider what it meant to navigate without paper maps, because for most of the frontier's early history, accurate maps simply did not exist. Rivers changed course, landmarks burned in wildfires or fell in storms. A man who trusted paper over lived experience was quite literally a man risking his life on outdated information. Instead, frontiersmen carried an entire geography inside their own memory. The sources of rivers, the safe fords, the territories where certain tribes hunted in summer and others in winter, the colour of water that told you whether the ground upstream was rock or soil, the position of the North Star relative to the pointer stars in the Big Dipper. All of it lived nowhere but inside a person's head, refined year after year by direct, often painful experience. This is really the heart of what we're exploring tonight. Not a list of clever tricks, though there are plenty of those, but an entire philosophy of survival, one built on observation, patience, adaptation, and an intimate, almost conversational relationship with a landscape most of us today would find completely unreadable. We're going to walk through how fire was coaxed from stone and steel in the middle of a snowstorm, how a soaked deer hide became warm, breathable clothing through a process involving of all things the animal's own brain, how trappers built boats from nothing but willow branches and hide when a flooding river left no other way across, how pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat, rendered fat and dried berries, could keep a person alive for weeks when there was nothing else to eat, and how that recipe came not from European settlers at all, but was learned gratefully and directly from indigenous peoples who had perfected it over many generations before any trapper ever set foot in these mountains. What strikes me most working through the historical record on all of this is how little of it was mysterious or magical. It wasn't luck and it wasn't some innate toughness. Some people are simply born with. It was knowledge. Learnable, teachable, transferable knowledge, built through trial and often deadly error, then carried forward by people who understood even then that this particular way of living wouldn't last forever. Beaver populations were already declining by the 1830s. Fashion in the cities back east was already shifting from beaver felt to silk, and the very skills that made frontier survival possible were already quietly beginning to fade even as they were being used. So let's go back to that cold October morning in the mountains, to the young trapper and his weathered guide, and let's follow them forward into the season ahead, because what they learned together out of necessity in a landscape that offered no second chances tells us something true, not just about the American frontier, but about what it actually takes for a person to survive when everything modern and convenient has been stripped away. The young trapper. We left waking to a footstep in the frost is in a sense every trapper who ever went west in that era, a composite drawn from journals. company records, and the oral traditions that historians have spent decades piecing back together. His mentor, the man the records and reconstructions call Bill, represents a type as much as an individual, the seasoned hand who had already survived what the newcomer hadn't yet faced. But the skills these two men rely on in the months that follow were real, documented in surviving trapper diaries, in company ledgers, in the accounts collected by ethnographers who interviewed the last living mountain men decades later, worried rightly that this knowledge would simply disappear. And it very nearly did. Fire is where this knowledge system begins, because without it nothing else matters. A modern person handed a piece of flint, a curved strip of high-carbon steel, and a scrap of scorched cloth would likely produce nothing but frustration and bruised knuckles. Yet for a trapper in the 1830s, this small kit carried in a leather pouch called a possible bag was the single most important possession he owned, more valuable in a genuine emergency than his rifle. The process itself required precision. Most people today would find surprising. The steel had to be struck at exactly the right angle to shave off a curl of hot metal rather than simply banging uselessly against stone. That spark then had to land on charcloth, a piece of cotton or linen that had been slowly burned in an airtight container until it would hold an ember without bursting into flame. Once caught, that fragile coal was nursed inside a bundle of dry grass or shredded bark with careful, patient breath, not too hard, not too soft, until at last a thread of smoke gave way to flame. It could take dozens of failed attempts to learn. It could take mere seconds once mastered. The gap between those two states, failure and a mastery, was often the entire difference between a warm night and a fatal one. What's easy to miss, looking back from a world of butane lighters and electric stoves, is how much this simple act of fire-making represented an entire body of chemistry and material science arrived at not through laboratories but through generations of trial. Much of it fatal to those who tried and failed before the knowledge was refined. The right carbon content in the steel mattered. The right dryness of tinder mattered. Even the season the charcloth was made mattered. None of this was written in a manual anywhere. It lived entirely in muscle memory and oral instruction passed from an experienced trapper to a newcomer, exactly the way our young trapper was learning it from Bill, hands guiding, hands mistake correcting mistake, until the knowledge finally moved, as one historian studying frontier apprenticeship put it, from the head into the body. Shelter followed a similar logic of borrowed wisdom. Contrary to the popular image of the self-sufficient frontiersman, conquering the wilderness through sheer grit, most of what allowed trappers to survive extreme cold actually came directly from indigenous nations who had lived in these mountains for thousands of years before any trapper arrived. The wickiup, that small domed shelter of bent saplings covered in bark and brush, was adapted almost wholesale from native building techniques, as was the half-faced camp, a three-sided structure angled specifically to reflect a fire's heat back onto the people sleeping inside it. Trappers who ignored this knowledge, who tried instead to recreate something closer to a European cabin using unsuitable materials and too much time often paid for that stubbornness with frostbite or worse. Survival here rewarded humility. It rewarded the willingness to learn from people who already knew the answer, rather than the desire to prove that European methods were somehow superior. That is not the story frontier mythology usually tells, but it is, according to the archaeological and ethnohistorical record, closer to the truth. The beaver itself deserves a slower look here too, because the animal at the centre of this entire economy was understood with a precision that borders on the scientific. Trappers used a substance called castoreum, harvested from glands near the base of the beaver's tail, as bait mixed with whiskey and warming spices into a paste that could draw a beaver from remarkable distances. For a long time, popular accounts described this simply as instinct or folk superstition, beaver attracted to beaver scent, because that's simply what beaver do. But it turns out the trappers had, without any formal biology, correctly identified something quite sophisticated, that castoreum functions as a territorial and social scent marker, and that both rival males investigating potential competition and females investigating a potential mate would be drawn toward it. It's worth pausing on the fact that castoreum did not disappear from human use once beaver hats fell out of fashion. It has in various refined forms shown up for well over a century in the perfume industry and occasionally in food flavoring, valued for a warm, slightly leathery, almost vanilla-like quality, entirely unrelated to its original purpose, luring an animal into a steel trap along a frozen riverbank. Very few of us dabbing on a fragrance today would ever imagine its distant echo tracing back to a mountain man kneeling in icy water at dawn. The traps themselves were unglamorous but effective forged iron devices, weighing around 5 pounds each, designed to catch a beaver by the leg, rather than to kill outright, because a drowned beaver's fur waterlogged was worth considerably less than one recovered, while the animal was still alive, however uncomfortable that fact might sit with a modern reader. A single prime pelt could fetch something in the range of $4 to $6 in the 1830s, which historians estimate translates to roughly somewhere between $100 and $200 in today's money. Though converting frontier-era currency into modern equivalents is always an inexact exercise, since the economies were structured so differently that a precise comparison is more art than arithmetic. What we can say with more confidence is that a genuinely successful season something in the range of 30 to 40 prime pelts represented real money, sometimes several months of a labourer's wages back east earned, through months of cold isolation and constant physical risk that few people today would willingly accept for any amount of pay. And the risk was not evenly distributed, or simply a matter of bad luck. It's worth being honest here that historians actually still debate how many trappers died during any given season in the peak decades of the fur trade, because company records were inconsistent. Many men worked independently outside any formal system, and death in the wilderness often left no paper trail at all, only an absence at the next year's rendezvous, a name simply never mentioned again. What the surviving records do make clear, though, is that death rarely came from the dramatic dangers most people imagine first. It came far more often from small preventable failures. Wet clothing that never fully dried in cold weather, a minor injury that turned septic with no way to treat it, poor judgment about which plants were safe to eat when supplies ran short. This is in fact precisely why frontier clothing mattered as much as any weapon a trapper carried. Cotton, when soaked through, loses nearly all its insulating value and stays wet for a dangerously long time in cold air. Buckskin tanned using a method that remarkably made use of the very same animal's brain to soften and preserve the hide block wind almost completely dried far more quickly, and when finished properly with smoke could resist stiffening even after repeated soakings. It sounds almost too tidy to be a coincidence that a single deer could, through this process, provide exactly the material needed to survive the cold that killed it. But the trappers who adopted this indigenous technique understood it as simple hard-earned fact rather than poetry. There is one story from this era, well documented and widely studied by historians of the fur trade, that captures just how thin the margin for error truly was. In the autumn of 1823, a trapper named Hugh Glass, working along a tributary of the Missouri River, was mauled almost to the point of death by a grizzly bear while scouting ahead of his party. His companions, believing his survival impossible, and fearing for their own safety in hostile territory, eventually left him behind with only minimal supplies, assuming reasonably, by the standards of the time, that they were leaving a dying man to a mercifully quick end. What followed instead was weeks of Glass dragging himself alone wounded and largely without food across roughly 200 miles of wilderness toward the nearest trading post, surviving in part on wild berries and according to some accounts, the meat of a wolf-killed bison calf he managed to reach before the wolves themselves returned. Historians still debate certain details of exactly how the journey unfolded, since the surviving accounts were written down years after the fact and vary in specifics, but the broader outline is well corroborated across multiple sources, and it stands even today as one of the most extraordinary documented instances of frontier survival on record. What strikes me most about the story isn't the drama of the bear attack itself, but what came after the quiet, grinding persistence of a badly injured man who simply refused to stop moving. One small decision at a time, day after day, until the wilderness that should have killed him instead delivered him against every reasonable expectation back to other people. It is that same quiet persistence multiplied across thousands of ordinary trappers whose names never made it into any book that the young man in our own story is slowly, painfully learning from Bill season by season, mistake by mistake. And as autumn deepens further into the mountains that year, as the first heavy snows begin to close, the high passes that education is about to be tested in a way that has nothing to do with fire or shelter or hide, and everything to do with a decision no map, no possible bag and no inherited skill could fully prepare him for. The decision Bill and the young trapper face that autumn has nothing dramatic about it on the surface, which is precisely what makes it so representative of frontier life. The river that once ran clear and manageable beside their camp has begun rising with the season's first heavy snowmelt from higher elevations, and within a single day, it transforms from a shallow, crossable stream into a churning brown torrent carrying entire uprooted trees downstream. Their traps staked along the near bank sit directly in the path of that rising water. Leaving them behind means losing equipment that cost real money and took real effort to acquire. Staying on the wrong side of a river that continues climbing means risking a flood that could sweep away far more than traps. There is no dramatic villain in this moment, no ambush, no gunfire. There is only water patience and a choice that has to be made with whatever materials happen to be at hand. What they build in response is called a bullboat, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives in popular accounts of the frontier, because it represents something close to genius disguised as crude improvisation. The design itself was borrowed directly from Plains Indigenous nations who've been building similar craft for generations before any trapper arrived, originally using buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame. A trapper without access to buffalo hide would substitute deer hide functionally, similar though somewhat less durable. The frame itself, a rough circle of bent willow branches roughly 7 feet across, reinforced with cross braces of pine sapling, could be assembled by 2 determined people in a matter of hours using only an axe head, a knife and rawhide cord for lashing. The hide stretched over that frame hair side down to reduce drag in the water, was then sealed at every seam with rendered animal fat to keep it watertight. The finished craft looked, if we are honest about it, almost comically primitive, a shallow round basin, bearing more resemblance to an oversized hide-covered basket than to any vessel most of us would trust our lives to. And yet variations of this exact design carried people safely across nearly every major river system in the American West for decades, a testament to how effective genuinely simple engineering can be when it is refined by necessity rather than by aesthetics. The physics of actually navigating one of these boats, though, reveals something the historical record doesn't always emphasize enough, which is just how much frontier survival depended on accepting imperfection rather than eliminating it. A bullboat has no keel, nothing to keep it stable in moving water, and it offers essentially no way to steer with any real precision. Crossing a flooded river in one meant surrendering a significant portion of control to the current itself, using a simple wooden pole not to direct the boat exactly where you wanted it to go, but merely to influence in small and constant adjustments where the river was already taking you. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it captures something true about the entire philosophy of frontier survival that we've been circling around since the beginning of this story. These were not people who believed they could dominate their environment through force of will or clever tools. They were people who had learned, often at great cost, that the wilderness could only be worked with, negotiated with, halfway. A trapper who tried to fight the current directly, rather than reading it and moving with it, was a trapper who capsized, lost his rifle, his powder, sometimes his life. Survival meant humility toward forces larger than yourself, expressed not as passive surrender, but as active, skillful cooperation. Once safely across whatever river needed, crossing a trapper's survival depended on an entirely different skill, one so foundational to frontier life that it rarely gets the recognition it deserves today, and that is the ability to navigate a landscape with no maps at all, or at best maps so inaccurate they were often more dangerous than useless. Accurate topographical surveys of the Rocky Mountain West simply did not exist in any meaningful form until decades later, which meant a trapper's entire working knowledge of the terrain, thousands of square miles of it, existed only in memory built through direct travel and oral tradition passed between trappers at their annual gatherings. This memory was extraordinarily detailed. A seasoned trapper could describe which fork of a river led toward good beaver habitat and which led toward hostile territory, could recall which mountain passes remained clear in early season and which held snow through summer, could recite the seasonal movement patterns of different tribal groups across a given valley the way a modern person might recite a familiar bus route. Historians studying this oral geographic tradition have noted that it functioned in practice as a genuinely sophisticated information system, remarkably accurate for a body of knowledge that existed nowhere on paper. Though, of course, we should be honest that its accuracy varied a great deal depending on the individual trapper and how recently that particular stretch of country had been travelled. Direction itself, absent any compass, was read from the sky and from the land in ways that reward closer examination. The sun's east to west arc offered the most obvious clue during daylight. At night, the North Star, located by tracing a line from the two outer stars of the Big Dipper's bowl, provided a fixed point that never moved regardless of the season, a piece of celestial navigation that had guided travelers for thousands of years before it guided any American trapper. On overcast days and nights, when neither sun nor stars were visible, trappers relied on subtler evidence. The direction water consistently flowed downhill, the position of familiar landmarks noted earlier in the journey, and more cautiously the tendency of moss to grow more thickly on the shaded, typically northern side of tree trunks. It's worth pausing here on an honest note, because this particular piece of folk wisdom, the moss growing on the north side of trees, has actually been challenged by modern naturalists who point out that moss growth depends far more on moisture shade and local microclimate than on compass direction alone, and can in fact appear on any side of a tree depending on surrounding conditions. Frontier trappers themselves seem to understand this nuance better than the tidy version of the saying that survives today. As one old trapper is recorded explaining to a newcomer, the rule described what happened most of the time, not what happened every time, and the frontier had a way of punishing anyone who mistook a general pattern for an absolute guarantee. Tracking the ability to read the signs. A person or animal leaves simply by moving through the world represents perhaps the most demanding and most quietly remarkable skill in this entire body of frontier knowledge. It required a level of sustained attention that modern life rarely asks of us anymore, a kind of total presence in which the smallest details, the crumbled edge of a footprint indicating recent passage, the particular angle at which a deer had nipped vegetation while browsing, a single strand of hair caught on a thorn bush, all carried meaning that had to be actively noticed rather than passively observed. Experienced trackers of this era could often estimate not just the species and direction of an animal, but roughly how long ago it had passed, based on details as fine as whether overnight frost had softened the sharp edges of a print. The same skill extended to reading human presence as well, since different indigenous nations often left recognizably different moccasin patterns, and an experienced trapper could sometimes estimate a group's size, how heavily they were burdened, and even whether they were traveling with the awareness that someone might be following them. Modern trackers and wilderness instructors, several of whom have studied and attempted to preserve fragments of this knowledge, describe it less as some mystical sixth sense and more as an intensely disciplined form of pattern recognition, the mind trained over years to notice disruption in an otherwise consistent natural rhythm. It is not so different in principle from how an experienced physician can sometimes notice something is subtly wrong before any test confirms it simply from years of looking closely at what healthy looks like. And running beneath all of these individual skills, connecting them into something larger than the sum of their parts, was a single quietly profound piece of food science that trappers adopted wholesale from the indigenous nations who had already perfected it long before any European ever set foot on this continent. Pemmican, a dense calorie-rich mixture of finely pounded dried meat rendered, fat and dried berries, could remain edible for years rather than months, an almost unbelievable claim in a world without refrigeration, yet one that modern food scientists have since confirmed makes real biochemical sense. The extreme dehydration of the meat removed nearly all the moisture that would otherwise support bacterial growth, while the rendered fat, properly prepared without scorching, created something close to a natural seal against oxidation and spoilage. A trapper carrying 20 pounds of pemmican was in effect carrying several weeks of guaranteed survival in his pack, a hedge against the very real possibility of a storm that made hunting or trapping impossible for days at a time. Historians of indigenous foodways note that this recipe and the word itself, borrowed from a Cree term, represents one of the more significant and least publicly credited technological contributions indigenous peoples made to frontier survival, a piece of practical genius that Lewis and Clark themselves relied on during their own expedition, and one that likely saved more frontier lives across the era than any rifle ever did. What becomes clear moving through all of this is that survival in this landscape was never really about individual heroism, however much later storytelling liked to frame it that way. It was about an accumulated, borrowed, endlessly refined body of practical knowledge, most of it originating with the people who had lived on this land for millennia. Before any trapper arrived, carried forward through careful teaching from one person to the next, exactly the way Bill was carrying it forward to the young man beside him. And as the season wears on and the two of them push deeper into the territory that grows less familiar with every mile that knowledge is about to meet its sternest test, yet not from weather or hunger, but from other people whose presence in these mountains long predates their own, and whose intentions in the gathering dusk ahead are not yet clear at all. Something shifts into the quality of attention a person carries once they understand they are no longer alone in a landscape they had until recently imagined as empty. That shift is worth pausing on because it corrects one of the more persistent misunderstandings about this entire era of American history. The wilderness the trappers moved through was never truly wild in the sense of being unclaimed or unknown. It was and had been for thousands of years a deeply inhabited world, layered with the seasonal movements, territorial understandings, and long histories of numerous indigenous nations, each with their own relationship to these mountains that long predated any trapper's arrival by centuries. What a newcomer experienced as untouched frontier. The people who actually lived there experienced as home, as hunting ground, as sacred space, as contested border, depending on exactly where a given valley happened to sit. This distinction mattered enormously in practice because survival on the frontier depended just as much on understanding human geography as it did on understanding rivers or weather. Different nations held different relationships to trappers moving through their territory and lumping them together. As popular frontier mythology has so often done, obscures a reality that was considerably more nuanced and frankly more interesting. The Blackfeet, whose territory covered some of the richest beaver country in the northern Rockies, had by the 1820s developed a well-founded hostility toward American trappers specifically rooted, partly in earlier violent encounters and partly in a clear-eyed understanding that these newcomers were extracting a resource the Blackfeet themselves depended on with no meaningful compensation or consent involved. The Crow, by contrast, more often maintained relationships closer to wary trade, willing to exchange goods and information, though a Crow party might still relieve a careless trapper of his horses given the opportunity. The Shoshone in certain regions developed working relationships with trapping parties that occasionally extended into marriage and long-term alliance. None of this was fixed. Alliances shifted with circumstances, with individual leaders, with the specific pressures a given group was facing that particular season, and a trapper's survival often depended on knowing or quickly learning which relationship applied to whichever stretch of territory he currently stood in. What's genuinely striking looking closely at the historical record is how much of this cross-cultural navigation depended not on violence, which is what popular imagination tends to emphasize, but on a working diplomatic language that developed specifically to bridge dozens of mutually unintelligible spoken languages across the Plains and Rocky Mountain West. This was Plains Indian Sign Language, an extraordinarily sophisticated system of hand signs that allowed people from entirely different linguistic backgrounds. Blackfeet Crow Shoshone, French-Canadian, trappers American, company men to conduct real conversations, negotiate trade exchange warnings, and settle disputes without either party understanding a single spoken word of the other's tongue. Some linguists who have studied it describe it as one of the most complete gestural languages ever documented, capable of expressing not just simple transactional needs but genuinely abstract ideas, time, intention, emotion, uncertainty. A trapper like the seasoned guide in our story would have carried a working vocabulary of perhaps a few hundred signs, enough to negotiate safe passage, explain his intentions, or warn of danger entirely through gesture. And this skill, invisible in most frontier paintings that prefer rifles and buckskin to quiet, careful handwork, was every bit as essential to staying alive as fire-making or tracking. Trade itself followed. Its own careful choreography, one that rewarded patience and small deliberate gestures of respect over any show of wealth or force. Tobacco glass, beads, metal tools, and coffee functioned as a kind of frontier currency, exchanged not merely for goods but as signals of peaceful intent offered before any substantive conversation could properly begin. A trapper who understood this rhythm, who approached an encounter slowly, hands visible, offering something small before asking for anything in return, dramatically improved his odds of walking away from any given meeting unharmed. A trapper who reached too quickly for a weapon, or displayed too much wealth too soon, invited exactly the kind of misunderstanding that could turn fatal in seconds. Scholars of the fur trade era still debate how frequently violent encounters actually occurred compared to how frequently they were narrowly avoided through exactly this kind of careful diplomacy, since surviving trappers naturally left more detailed accounts than those who did not survive to write anything down at all, which almost certainly skews the historical record towards stories with fortunate endings. There is a particular gathering that deserves attention here, because it represents one of the more remarkable social institutions to emerge from this entire era, and it rarely receives the recognition it deserves outside specialist histories. Each summer, trappers scattered across an enormous stretch of wilderness would converge on a predetermined location, often somewhere along the Green River in present-day Wyoming, for what became known as the rendezvous. For a period of days or sometimes weeks, this gathering might draw well over 100 trappers along with company agents, traders and representatives from numerous indigenous nations, all converging on a single valley that stood empty and silent the rest of the year. Pelts were traded for the coming year's supplies. News travelled between men who had spent 8 or 9 months in near total isolation. Marriages were sometimes arranged. Alliances were renewed or occasionally tested. It was, by most surviving accounts, an atmosphere of genuine intensity celebration mixed uneasily with negotiation, old friendships mixed with new tensions, all compressed into a brief window before everyone scattered again into the wilderness for another long season of solitude. What almost never makes it into popular retellings of the rendezvous is how functionally important these gatherings were as an information network in an era with no postal service reaching this deep into unmapped territory, no newspapers, nothing resembling reliable communication across hundreds of miles. Word of tribal conflicts, of dangerous parties moving through certain valleys of shifting beaver populations in one drainage or another, travelled almost entirely through these annual meetings and the informal trapper networks that connected to them. A warning delivered at rendezvous or carried by a trapper, crossing paths with another party on the trail might be the only advance notice anyone in the surrounding wilderness would ever receive of a serious threat approaching. This single fact, easy to overlook, meant that individual survival on the frontier was never quite as solitary as the mountain mythology likes to suggest. Even men who spent most of the year in radical isolation at critical moments on a wider web of shared information and mutual warning that stretched across an area larger than several European countries combined. It's worth asking honestly how reliable any of this information actually was by the time it reached the person who needed it most. A warning about a hostile party's movement might already be several days old by the time it changed hands, the party in question having long since shifted direction or dispersed entirely. Historians studying frontier communication networks have noted this same uncertainty repeatedly, that trappers were in effect making life and death decisions based on second-hand or third-hand accounts of events that had often already changed by the time the news travelled far enough to matter. And yet, imperfect as it was, this network of shared spoken information very likely saved more lives across the era than any single individual's wilderness skill ever could on its own. Because knowing that danger existed somewhere in a given direction, even without perfect precision, was often enough to prompt exactly the kind of caution that made the difference between a safe passage and a fatal one. As the season our two travellers are moving through edges closer toward its own rendezvous, the wilderness around them is quietly changing character in ways that have nothing to do with weather. Word is beginning to move through the mountains ahead of them, carried hand to hand and sign to sign between parties they haven't yet met, and what that word contains will shape everything that happens in the days still to come. The word moving through the mountains that autumn, as it turns out, carries less immediate danger than the two travellers initially feared, though what it reveals about the wider currents shaping their world is in its own way more consequential than any single threat could have been. News travelling hand to hand and sign to sign across hundreds of miles rarely arrives in tidy form, and by the time it reaches any particular camps, it has often been shaped and reshaped by every person who carried it forward. But beneath the immediate concerns of any given season, a much larger and slower moving story was already unfolding across the entire fur trade, one that neither the young trapper nor his mentor could have fully grasped from inside a single valley, though men like Bill, older and more widely travelled, were beginning to feel its edges. That larger story begins, oddly enough, not in the mountains at all, but in the boardrooms and counting houses of London and Montreal, where two competing fur companies were engaged in a rivalry that would shape the fate of the entire beaver population across the American West. The Hudson's Bay Company, operating primarily out of Canada, had grown concerned by the 1820s about American trappers pushing westward into territory the company considered its own economic sphere. Their response, documented in company correspondence that historians have studied closely, was a deliberate and rather startling strategy that came to be known as the Fur Desert Policy. Rather than simply competing for pelts in the disputed Snake River country of the Pacific Northwest, the company instructed its own trapping brigades to systematically overtrap the region, killing beaver far beyond what sustainable harvest would allow, with the explicit goal of exhausting the resource entirely so that American trappers would have no economic reason to venture into that territory at all. It is a strange thing to sit with a corporation intentionally destroying the very resource its business depended on purely to deny that resource to a competitor, and it stands as one of the more calculated acts of environmental exploitation in the entire history of the North American fur trade. Though it should be said that scholars still disagree about exactly how effective the policy actually was in practice, since beaver populations in parts of that region had already been under significant pressure from years of ordinary trapping before the deliberate strategy began. This kind of large-scale, almost industrial thinking about wilderness resources sits uncomfortably against the intimate hand-to-hand knowledge. We've spent so much time exploring the careful reading of river current and animal sign, the patient work of softening a single deer hide with its own brain matter. And yet both realities existed simultaneously, the deeply personal and the coldly commercial often carried by the very same men. A trapper, like Bill, lived by an ethic of taking only what was needed, resetting a trap carefully, leaving unused portions of a kill for the forest's other creatures, a philosophy that shows up again and again in surviving trapper accounts and oral histories. But the industry that employed him was at the very same moment engaged in resource extraction on a scale that would prove entirely unsustainable within a single generation. It's worth pausing on this contradiction rather than smoothing it over, because it says something true and a little uncomfortable about how individual decency and larger systemic harm can exist side by side without either one cancelling out the other. The beaver population itself paid the steepest price for this collision of intimate skill and industrial appetite. Historians estimate that beaver numbers across significant portions of the Rocky Mountain West declined by well over 90% during the peak decades of the fur trade, though. As with so much of this era's statistics, the precise figures remain genuinely difficult to pin down, since no comprehensive population surveys existed at the time, and modern estimates are necessarily reconstructed from fragmentary trapping records company, shipping logs, and later ecological studies. What we can say with more confidence is that trappers themselves, men who depended entirely on reading the land accurately, were noticing the decline directly and describing it in their own accounts. Valleys that had once yielded dozens of prime pelts in a season, producing only a handful by the 1830s, forcing trapping parties to range further and further into increasingly remote and often more dangerous territory, simply to maintain the harvest their livelihoods depended on. And then, almost as if the wilderness itself had negotiated a strange kind of mercy, the entire economic foundation of this brutal, skillful way of life began to erode from a direction no trapper in the mountains could have anticipated or influenced in the slightest. Fashion changed in Paris and London. Silk imported at increasing volume from China began replacing felted beaver fur as the material of choice for fashionable men's hats sometime in the 1830s, a shift driven by consumer taste in cities thousands of miles from any beaver pond, entirely disconnected from the mountains where men had been risking their lives to supply the previous fashion. It is worth sitting with how strange this really is, that an entire industry built on extraordinary physical skill, deep environmental knowledge, and constant mortal risk could be undone, not by exhaustion of the resource, though that exhaustion was real and accelerating, but by a change in what wealthy men in European cities decided looked stylish on their heads. By the 1840s, beaver pelt prices had fallen dramatically, and the rendezvous system itself, that great annual gathering we spent time with earlier, was already in visible decline, drawing fewer trappers and less trade with each passing year. There is something worth asking here gently, without any need for a dramatic answer. What happens to an entire body of hard-won, deeply specific knowledge when the economic reason for its existence simply disappears? This is not a rhetorical flourish, so much as a genuine historical question. And the honest answer is that we don't fully know, because so much of this knowledge was never written down in the first place. Some skills persisted in altered form passed to settlers, to later generations of hunters and guides to indigenous communities who had, of course, originated much of this knowledge long before any trapper arrived and continued practicing it long after the fur trade collapsed. Other skills, the very specific techniques for reading a particular river's seasonal moods, the exact recipe of spices favoured by one trapper for his castoreum bait, simply vanished with the individuals who carried them, since no one had any remaining reason to pass them forward to a new apprentice. It's worth noting too that the human cost of this era extended well beyond the trappers themselves in ways the frontier mythology has traditionally been slow to acknowledge. The same decades that saw trappers moving deeper into indigenous territories also saw devastating waves of introduced disease, smallpox in particular, moving ahead of and alongside the fur trade's expansion, decimating native populations who had no historical exposure and therefore no immunity to these illnesses. Some historians estimate that certain plains nations lost more than half their population to smallpox epidemics during this general period. A catastrophe that reshaped the political and territorial landscape of the entire region in ways that directly affected which nations held power, which alliances shifted, and which territories opened to increased trapping pressure in the years that followed. This context rarely appears in the adventure narratives built around figures like Hugh Glass or the Mountain Men generally, yet it sat directly alongside every single interaction we've discussed. Every trade negotiated through hand sign, every warning passed between a crow scouting party and a pair of trappers pushing toward a rendezvous. The wilderness these men moved through was not simply beautiful and dangerous. It was also quietly and often invisibly to the trappers themselves, a landscape already being profoundly reshaped by forces set in motion well before any individual rapper person chaiters came into play. None of this diminishes the genuine skill, the accumulated wisdom, or the very real courage that allowed people like Bill and his young apprentice to survive seasons that killed so many others. If anything, understanding the larger current surrounding their individual story adds something important to it, a sense of scale, a recognition that even the most self-reliant seeming individuals were always operating within forces far larger than themselves. Whether those forces took the shape of a distant fashion trend, a corporate strategy decided in a London boardroom, or a disease carried unknowingly along routes that had until recently connected only indigenous nations to one another. The frontier was never simply a stage for individual heroism. It was a place where countless different histories, personal, economic, environmental, and tragic, all pressed against each other at once. And the survival skills we've spent so much time exploring tonight existed precisely at that pressure point, tools for navigating not just a difficult landscape, but an entire world already in the process of irreversible change. As the beaver economy that shaped Bill's entire adult life continues quietly declining around him, even as he teaches his young companion skills. He has spent 16 winters perfecting a question begins to take shape in the story that neither man has spoken aloud yet, one that has less to do with surviving the current season, and more to do with what kind of life, if any, still waits for a mountain man, once the mountains themselves no longer need him in quite the same way. That unspoken question, what remains of a life once its purpose dissolves, turns out to have an answer more complicated and more hopeful than either Bill or his young companion could have guessed. though the answer took the better part of 2 centuries to fully reveal itself, and it came from directions neither man could have imagined sitting beside a fire in the Rocky Mountains in the 1830s. Much of what we actually know today about frontier survival skills exists because of a quiet, almost accidental rescue operation carried out decades after the Mountain Man era had already ended by people who were not historians in any formal sense, but who understood with a kind of urgency that feels remarkably contemporary that a body of irreplaceable knowledge was disappearing in real time. Beginning in the latter decades of the 1800s and continuing well into the 1900s, a scattered network of ethnographers, journalists, and simply curious individuals began seeking out the last surviving mountain men, by then elderly, often living quietly on the margins of a country that had transformed almost beyond recognition since their trapping days, and asking them patiently to describe exactly how things had been done. Some of this work was formal, conducted by early anthropologists affiliated with institutions like the Smithsonian, who recognized that first-hand accounts of frontier and indigenous survival techniques would soon exist nowhere except in fading memory. A great deal more of it, though, was informal, conducted by amateur historians as family members or simply people who found themselves seated across from an old trapper willing finally to talk. What emerges from these interviews, preserved now in archives, historical society collections, and a scattering of published memoirs, is a body of knowledge considerably richer and more precise than most popular accounts of the frontier ever convey. One particularly striking example involves the practice of reading river water for hidden danger, the very skill Bill demonstrates to his young companion in tracing the difference between clear water and murky, between a smooth surface and one humped subtly over a submerged obstacle. Modern hydrologists studying historical trapper accounts have noted with some genuine surprise how closely this folk knowledge aligns with formal principles of river hydraulics that would not be scientifically codified for another century. The subtle standing wave that forms over a submerged rock, which trappers learn to recognize purely through repeated careful observation, is exactly the kind of surface disturbance that modern whitewater safety courses still teach today, described now with technical vocabulary but functionally identical to what an illiterate trapper in 1831 understood entirely through pattern and consequence through watching, presumably what happened to boats and people who misjudged that particular ripple. The buckskin tanning process deserves a similar second look because it turns out to rest on genuine biochemistry that took considerably longer for formal science to explain than it took frontier apprentices to master through repetition. The reason brain matter works so effectively as a tanning agent, as strange as the practice sounds to modern ears, lies in its high concentration of natural oils and a fatty substance called lecithin, both of which work their way into the hide's fiber structure and prevent the collagen from binding rigidly as the hide dries, the exact stiffening that ruins an improperly treated skin. Rough folk saying recorded by more than one 19th century observer of indigenous and frontier tanning practices, suggesting that every animal carries within its own skull just enough material to tan its own hide. And while this sounds almost too neat to be literally true across every species, modern chemists examining the composition of mammalian brain tissue have found the underlying claim holds up reasonably well across a wide range of animals, since brain tissue tends to be remarkably consistent in its fat and lecithin content regardless of the species it comes from. It is worth acknowledging some honest uncertainty here, since exact proportion do vary somewhat by species and by the specific hide being treated, and frontier practitioners themselves clearly understood through experience that certain hides required adjustment. More working time, a different smoking duration, small variations passed down not as fixed formula but as adaptive skill, the kind of knowledge that resists being reduced to a single simple rule no matter how satisfying that rule might sound. Perhaps the most quietly remarkable piece of preserved frontier knowledge though concerns something that never appears in the adventure-focused retellings at all, and that is the sophisticated understanding these trappers developed of nutrition and caloric density, arrived at with no formal science whatsoever, purely through the unforgiving feedback of a body that either had enough fuel to survive brutal cold or didn't. The intense preference for beaver tail and organ meats, the deliberate seeking out of fat wherever it could be found, the precise ratio maintained in pemmican preparation, roughly equal parts by volume of dried meat and rendered fat. These were not arbitrary preferences or crude appetite. Modern nutritional analysis confirms that fat provides more than twice the caloric density of protein or carbohydrate by weight, an absolutely critical consideration for anyone needing to carry maximum survivable energy across long winter travel without the luxury of frequent resupply. Trappers had in effect independently arrived at an accurate practical understanding of caloric density through nothing more than sustained attention to which foods kept a person warm and functional through brutal cold and which did not. A form of applied nutritional science that predates the formal discipline by the better part of a century, refined the same way every other frontier skill was refined through consequences that were immediate, personal, and occasionally fatal for those who got the balance wrong. One might reasonably ask, and it's a fair question, why so much of this knowledge nearly vanished entirely if it was genuinely this sophisticated and this valuable. Part of the answer lies simply in how narrow the window for transmission actually was. Unlike indigenous knowledge systems which had been developed and maintained across many successive generations, embedded in oral tradition, ceremony, and continuous practice that stretched back centuries, the specifically frontier trapper adaptation of this knowledge existed for a remarkably brief historical window, really only a few decades at the height of the fur trade era, concentrated among a relatively small population of men who were by the nature of their profession isolated, frequently illiterate, and often disinclined toward the kind of storytelling that would preserve their methods for anyone beyond their immediate trapping partners. When the economic reason for the profession dissolved as beaver pelt prices collapsed and settlement patterns shifted westward in entirely different directions, many former trappers scattered into other occupations, faded into obscurity, or in some documented cases simply chose not to speak of that period of their lives at all, treating it, as one later interviewer noted with some frustration, less as an achievement to share, and more as a private closed chapter. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, since it says something true about how historical memory actually works, often quite differently from how we assume it should. The dramatic, violent episodes of the frontier era, the armed conflicts, the occasional massacres, the larger political confrontations between expanding settlement and indigenous resistance were extensively documented at the time, covered in newspapers, recorded in military reports, eventually mythologized in dime novels and later in film. But the quiet, unglamorous, genuinely life-saving knowledge, how to soften a hide, how to read a river's mood, how to coax fire from stone in a snowstorm, was almost never considered worth writing down by the people who actually possessed it, precisely because it was so thoroughly ordinary to them. Why would a trapper bother recording something every trapper he knew already understood? It is only in hindsight, once that shared understanding had nearly disappeared entirely from living memory, that its rarity and its value became fully visible. Fortunately, the rescue effort that began with those late 19th and early 20th century interviews did not end there. In more recent decades, a small but genuinely dedicated community of primitive skills instructors, wilderness archaeologists, and living history practitioners has worked to reconstruct, test, and in some cases physically relearn these techniques through direct practice rather than simply reading about them secondhand. Several of the historians and instructors whose research informs accounts like this one have personally built and paddled bullboats, personally struck flint against steel until their hands bled and eventually until fire came reliably, personally tanned hides, using brain matter. Exactly as described in the old accounts, treating the process not as historical curiosity, but as a genuine test of whether the old descriptions actually held up under real conditions. This hands-on verification matters, more than it might initially seem to, because it confirms something important, that these were not exaggerated tall tales passed down through generations of embellishment, but functional, repeatable, physically demanding skills that worked exactly as described, provided a person was willing to put in the same patient hours of practice that the original trappers had. What remains genuinely uncertain, and probably always will, is the precise texture of daily life for any specific individual trapper. Since so few left detailed personal accounts, and the ones that survive were often written or dictated years, sometimes decades after the events they describe, filtered through memory, through the storyteller's own sense of what made a good tale, and occasionally through a later interviewer's own assumptions about what frontier life ought to have looked like. Historians working carefully with this material have to hold two things simultaneously: a genuine respect for what these first-hand accounts preserve, and an honest acknowledgement that no single trapper's memory, however vivid, can stand imperfectly for the full varied reality of thousands of individual lives lived across several decades and an enormous stretch of geography. The composite figures we follow tonight, the trapper and his mentor, exist precisely in that careful space, built from many overlapping real accounts rather than drawn from any single verified individual, a choice that lets the story honor the texture of frontier life without claiming a false precision the historical record simply cannot support. And so as the light continues fading over that rocky mountain valley where our story began, and as the young trapper's education moves toward whatever waits for him at that summer's rendezvous, it becomes worth turning our attention gently towards the wider question sitting underneath everything we've explored so far. Not simply what these skills were, remarkable as they remain even now, but what they might still be able to teach a person listening from somewhere far more comfortable. Centuries removed from any beaver stream, about attention, about patience, and about what it actually means to know a place well enough that it might in return agree to keep you alive. The wider question we're circling toward, what these vanished skills might still say to us now, has to wait just a little longer, because there is one more dimension of frontier survival we haven't yet touched, and it may be the most consequential of all, quietly absent from nearly every popular telling of the Mountain Man story, despite being central to whether most trappers survived at all. That missing piece is the role of indigenous women, many of whom became wives to trappers through unions. The fur trade era referred to somewhat coldly as marriages after the custom of the country. These were not casual or incidental relationships, and describing them that way, as many older popular histories unfortunately did, badly understates both their prevalence and their practical importance. Historians studying company records and missionary accounts from this period estimate that a very significant proportion, quite possibly a majority of long-term trappers, eventually formed such partnerships, and the reasons were almost entirely practical rather than romantic in the way modern audiences might assume, though genuine affection and lasting partnership certainly did develop in many documented cases as well. A trapper working alone, however skilled, faced enormous limitation. He could hunt, trap, and travel, but the labor of processing hides for trade sewing, moccasins and clothing suited to the terrain preparing pemmican, in the volumes needed for an entire season, and maintaining camp during a partner's absence on extended trapping circuits required more hands and more specialized knowledge than any one person could reasonably provide alone. Indigenous wives brought skills that were in the most literal sense indispensable to a trapper's survival, often skills considerably more refined than anything the trapper himself had managed to learn second-hand. The fine even stitching required for genuinely waterproof durable moccasins, the precise timing and technique for properly smoking a hide so it would resist stiffening after repeated soaking, the detailed knowledge of which regional plants could supplement a diet dangerously thin in certain nutrients during long winters, These were skills perfected over lifetimes within specific indigenous communities, refined across many generations, rather than picked up hastily by an apprentice trapper over a single season. Beyond the practical labor itself, these marriages frequently created genuine diplomatic and kinship connections between trapping parties and the specific nations the wife belonged to, connections that could mean the difference between being recognized as family, even distant family, during a tense encounter rather than being regarded simply as an unwelcome outsider passing through contested territory. It is worth being honest that the power dynamics within these relationships varied enormously and were not uniformly equitable by any measure, shaped by everything from individual personalities to the deep imbalances of the broader colonial context surrounding the fur trade as a whole, and historians continue to debate how best to characterize the full range of these partnerships, since surviving records were almost always written down by the trapper or by company officials, rarely if ever by the women themselves, which leaves a significant and probably permanent gap in whose voice actually survives in the historical account. What is documented with more clarity is just how enormous a gap existed between the modest earnings of an individual trapper and the almost unimaginable wealth accumulated by the businessmen who financed and organized the trade from cities the trappers themselves would rarely if ever see again. John Jacob Astor, who founded the American Fur Company in 1808, would eventually become, by most historical estimates, the wealthiest man in the United States at the time of his death. His fortune built substantially on the beaver pelts that men like the trappers in our story risked their lives, gathering one frozen river crossing and one careful negotiation at a time. A trapper earning perhaps $30 for a full and genuinely dangerous season's worth of pelts was in effect contributing to a fortune that would eventually be measured in the tens of millions. A gap so enormous it is difficult to translate meaningfully into modern terms. Though most economic historians agree it represents one of the starkest disparities between individual physical risk and concentrated corporate reward in the entire economic history of the early United States, it is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. The man in the mountains reading river, currents and coaxing fire from stone in a snowstorm was engaged in some of the most demanding, skillful physical labor imaginable, and yet the overwhelming majority of the wealth his labor generated flowed almost entirely elsewhere toward people who never once had to cross a flooding river in a boat made of willow branches and deer hide. This disparity connects to something else. The historical record makes fairly clear, which is that the mountain man's life, for all its skill and self-reliance, was often quite short, or at least the working portion of it was. Precise life expectancy figures are difficult to establish with confidence, since so many trappers simply disappeared from the record without any documented cause, their absence at the following year's rendezvous. The only real evidence that something had gone wrong somewhere in the intervening months. But historians working from the fragments that do survive company employment records, occasional newspaper mentions, missionary journals, noting deaths among trapping parties they encountered, generally estimate that relatively few men sustained an active trapping career for much more than a decade, with many meeting their end far sooner through drowning, through violent encounter, through untreated injury or illness, or simply through the slow accumulated toll of a body pushed past its limits, winter after winter, with no meaningful rest or medical care available. Bill's own claim in our story of 16 Winters in the Mountains would have placed him among a genuinely small minority who survived that long, which goes some distance toward explaining both his hard-earned caution and the quiet weight the young trapper senses whenever the older man speaks of those who didn't make it back. There is one more layer worth adding here, because it changes how we should picture these rendezvous gatherings we spent time with earlier, and it comes not from written history at all, but from archaeology. In recent decades, researchers working at several confirmed rendezvous sites across present-day Wyoming and Utah have carefully excavated the ground where these annual gatherings once stood. And what they have found complicates the picture in a genuinely interesting way. Rather than a purely rugged, improvised affair, the archaeological evidence, fragments of imported ceramics, glass beadwork, remnants of manufactured goods traded up from the eastern seaboard and beyond, suggest these gatherings involved a surprisingly wide and sophisticated network of material goods flowing in from a considerable distance. Evidence of just how thoroughly connected even this remote wilderness gathering actually was to distant markets and manufacturing centres most of the attendees would never personally see. The wilderness these men inhabited, for all its isolation, was never truly separate from the wider currents of a rapidly globalizing economy. A fact the physical remnants in the ground make considerably more vivid than any single written account ever could. As that particular rendezvous draws nearer for the young trapper and his mentor in our own story, carrying with it both the promise of human company after months of near total isolation and the quiet uncertainty of encountering a world he has not seen in nearly a year, it becomes worth turning finally toward what waits on the other side of that gathering, and toward the harder, more personal question of what a person carries forward once a season this transformative has run its course. Whatever waited for the young trapper on the far side of that rendezvous, the historical pattern surrounding men in his position suggests two broad paths, and it's worth understanding both, because together they tell us something honest about how this entire chapter of American life actually came to a close. Not in one dramatic moment, but in thousands of small individual decisions made by men scattered across an enormous and rapidly changing landscape. Some trappers, having tasted the isolation and hardship of a single season, returned east and never went back, folding their brief wilderness experience into a life that more closely resembled the one they had left, farming, trading, settling into towns that were themselves growing rapidly westward. Others, and this group is considerably better documented because their choices left more lasting institutional traces, found that the wilderness had reshaped something in them that made a return to conventional town life feel, as more than one surviving account puts it, genuinely unbearable. These men often drifted toward roles that let them remain connected to the frontier, even as the beaver trade itself withered, becoming guides for the wagon trains and emigrant parties that began moving west in growing numbers through the 1840s. Men whose intimate knowledge of mountain passes, river crossings, and indigenous diplomacy proved just as valuable, arguably more valuable in this new context as it had ever been in trapping. This transition matters more than it might first appear, because it means the specific skills we've spent so much time exploring tonight did not simply vanish the moment beaver hat fashion collapsed in Europe. They migrated, carried forward by former trappers into an entirely new economic role, guiding settlers across the same mountains, along the same rivers, through many of the same diplomatic relationships with indigenous nations that trapping had originally required them to master. Figures like Jim Bridger, whose own trapping career began in the 1820s, would go on to become one of the most sought-after guides of the wagon train era, eventually establishing a trading post that served a migrant traffic for decades. His mountain man knowledge, repurposed almost entirely intact for an entirely different historical moment. It's a reminder that historical transitions rarely happen as cleanly as the phrase "end of an era" suggests. Knowledge doesn't switch off simply because its original economic purpose fades. It gets carried, adapted, and applied somewhere new by people who often had no idea at the time that they were serving as a kind of living bridge between two very different periods of American expansion. There is a quieter, less celebrated version of this same transition that deserves attention too, because it involves the mixed heritage children born of the marriages we discussed earlier. Children who grew up fluent in both the practical wilderness knowledge of their trapper fathers and the deep generationally refined knowledge of their indigenous mothers, Historians of the fur trade era have noted that many of these individuals went on to occupy genuinely crucial intermediary roles in the decades that followed, serving as interpreters, guides, and cultural intermediaries precisely because they possessed something neither purely trapper nor purely indigenous knowledge alone could offer a fluency in both worlds simultaneously. Some of the most historically significant guides and interpreters of the mid-19th century American West came from exactly this background, though their contributions have often received considerably less recognition in popular history than the more famous trapper figures whose names survive more prominently in the written record, a gap that recent historical scholarship has been working gradually to correct. What happened to the physical landscape itself during this same period offers its own quiet form of evidence for how thoroughly this era of intensive trapping reshaped the environment, evidence that ecologists have only been able to properly appreciate in recent decades. Beaver we now understand with considerably more scientific precision than any trapper of the 1830s possessed function as what ecologists call a keystone species, meaning their presence or absence disproportionately shapes the entire surrounding ecosystem far beyond what their modest size might suggest. Beaver dams create wetland habitat that supports an enormous range of other species, slow and filter water flow in ways that reduce downstream flooding and erosion and gradually build up rich soil deposits behind their dams that support distinctive plant communities found almost nowhere else. When beaver populations collapsed across vast stretches of the Rocky Mountain West during the trapping era, entire wetland ecosystems collapsed alongside them. Streams that had once been slow marshy and biologically rich became faster, narrower, and considerably less hospitable to the wide range of species that had depended on beaver engineering for generations. Some ecologists studying this period describe it as one of the largest, least visible ecological transformations in North American history, precisely because it happened gradually across decades in places few people beyond the trappers themselves were paying close attention, leaving no dramatic single moment for later historians to point to, only a slow, cumulative reshaping of the land that becomes visible mainly in hindsight through comparison of historical accounts against the very different landscape ecologists observe in many of these same valleys today. It is worth asking honestly whether the men doing the trapping understood any of this at the time, whether Bill, watching beaver sign grow thinner in familiar valleys, season after season, understood he was witnessing not simply a temporary decline in a resource, but the early stages of a genuine ecological transformation. The honest answer, based on surviving trapper accounts, is that they understood the practical consequence extremely well. Fewer beaver meaning longer trap lines, more distant travel, harder seasons, but there is little evidence they grasped or had any reason to grasp. Given the state of ecological science at the time, the broader cascading effects their harvesting was setting in motion across the wider landscape. This gap between immediate practical knowledge and larger systemic understanding is worth sitting with, because it appears again and again throughout this story, in the fur companies pursuing short-term competitive advantage without fully reckoning with long-term resource. Collapse in individual trappers focused entirely on surviving the current season without necessarily seeing the larger pattern their combined efforts were creating. Historians and ecologists alike continue to debate exactly how much long-term ecological damage can be attributed specifically to the fur trade era as opposed to the later considerably more intensive waves of settlement, agriculture and industrial development that followed close behind it, since these overlapping pressures make it genuinely difficult to isolate one era's specific ecological signature with full confidence. There is in more recent decades a small but meaningful postscript to this ecological story, one that feels worth including. Here, precisely because it offers a rare thread of quiet restoration rather than only loss, beginning in earnest around the middle of the 20th century, and continuing with growing momentum in recent years. Conservation biologists and land management agencies across the American West have increasingly worked to reintroduce beaver populations to watersheds where they had been absent for generations, having come to recognize through careful ecological study precisely the keystone role these animals once played and could play again. In numerous documented cases, streams that had run dry or badly degraded for the better part of a century have shown measurable, sometimes quite dramatic, recovery within just a few years of beaver returning to re-establish their dams and lodges. Wetland habitat rebuilding itself largely on its own, once the animals responsible for engineering it were simply allowed back into the landscape. It is a strange and rather moving thing to consider that the same animal whose pursuit shaped an entire era of frontier survival skill, whose pelt built fortunes and cost countless lives, whose absence quietly reshaped watersheds across an enormous stretch of the continent, is now understood by scientists as one of the more promising tools available for healing some of that same damage nearly 2 centuries later. As our own trapper and his mentor move at last toward whatever the rendezvous holds for them, carrying pelts that represent both the season survived and in ways neither man could have fully understood at the time, a small contribution to changes rippling forward across generations. They would never live to see it, becomes worth turning our attention toward the final shape of their story and toward what, if anything, enters once the immediate danger has passed and the long season of learning finally gives way to something more like rest. The gathering itself, when the young trapper and Bill finally descend from the mountains and into that valley crowded with fires and voices, after so many months of near total silence, turns out to hold a harder economic truth beneath its surface than either man may have fully articulated, one that historians have only in recent decades begun to describe with the weight it deserves. Prices at Rendezvous were set almost entirely by the company that organized the gathering and controlled the supply lines bringing goods out from the eastern seaboard. And those prices were, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. A pound of coffee, a length of cloth, a new blanket, all of it arrived after an enormously expensive overland journey, and companies passed that cost forward with substantial additional markup, sometimes reaching many hundreds of % above what the same goods would have cost in St. Louis. A trapper arriving with 30 or 40 prime pelts representing a full season of extreme physical risk might find that a single season's worth of basic resupply powder, lead traps to replace worn ones, a bit of tobacco and coffee consume nearly the entire value of everything he'd brought into trade. Some historians studying company ledgers from this period describe the resulting system as functioning in practice, if not in official design, remarkably close to a form of debt bondage trappers, perpetually a season behind, never quite accumulating enough surplus to walk away from the trade, entirely obligated instead to head back out for another season simply to settle accounts from the last one. It is worth being careful here, since not every company operated identically and not every trapper's individual financial situation followed this same pattern. Exactly, some men did manage to accumulate real savings over the years, particularly those who trapped independently rather than under direct company contract, but the broader structural pattern documented across multiple major fur companies operating in this era suggests that for a great many ordinary trappers, the romantic image of independent frontier wealth sat quite far from the more constrained economic reality they actually lived inside. This detail matters because it reshapes something important about how we should understand men like Bill, and by extension the choice our young trapper is weighing as his own season draws toward its close. The decision to return to the mountains for another season and another after that was rarely a simple matter of pure preference of a man choosing wilderness freedom over civilization purely because he found the mountains more meaningful. For many trappers, it was also quite plainly an economic trap, almost as literal as the steel devices they set along frozen riverbanks, one that made genuine departure from the trapping life considerably harder than popular frontier mythology tends to acknowledge. And yet reading through the surviving trapper accounts collected by later historians and interviewers, something else comes through clearly as well. A genuine, freely chosen attachment to this way of life that existed alongside, not instead of its economic constraints. Men who had every practical opportunity to leave, who had settled debts and could have walked away entirely quite often, chose instead to return to the mountains, describing something in later interviews that sounds remarkably consistent across dozens of independent accounts. A sense that the wilderness had reordered their relationship to time, to danger, to their own attention in a way that made the structured predictability of town life feel as one aging trapper put it decades later, like living with the volume turned down on everything that had once felt genuinely alive. It's worth pausing on this tension rather than resolving it too neatly, because both things are almost certainly true simultaneously for a great many of these men. Economic circumstance narrowing their practical choices considerably, and genuine personal transformation making the wilderness feel, despite everything it cost them, like the place they most fully belonged. Historians studying frontier psychology, working from the somewhat thin but genuinely suggestive evidence available in surviving letters and later interviews, note that this combination constrained circumstance, layered beneath authentic attachment, appears again and again across very different eras and very different frontier occupations, and it resists the kind of clean, simple explanation that popular storytelling often prefers. What happened to the mountain man image itself in the wider American imagination, meanwhile, followed its own strange and somewhat separate trajectory, one that began accelerating even before the trapping era had fully ended, beginning in the 1840s and continuing with real intensity through the following decades. A genre of cheap, mass-produced adventure fiction known as the dime novel began mythologizing frontier figures for an Eastern readership, hungry for tales of danger and rugged individualism, most of it written by authors who had never traveled west of the Mississippi themselves, drawing instead on second-hand accounts, considerable imagination, and a fairly clear sense of what would sell. These stories flattened the genuinely complex, often difficult, frequently collaborative reality. We've spent this entire evening exploring into something simpler and more marketable, the solitary hero conquering an empty wilderness through sheer individual grit, a version of the story that conveniently erased the extensive indigenous knowledge these skills were built upon, minimized the constant negotiation and diplomacy that kept most trappers alive far more often than any gunfight did, and largely ignored the economic constraints binding many of these men to a trade they could not easily leave. It is genuinely strange and worth sitting with that the popular image of the mountain man most of us carry today, self-reliant, taciturn, essentially a lone wolf, moving through untouched wilderness, was substantially shaped not by the trappers themselves but by writers in New York and Philadelphia who had never once slept outdoors in a Rocky Mountain winter, crafting a marketable fantasy that has in many ways outlasted the more complicated truth it replaced. Some of the actual surviving trapper testimony pushes back against this flattened image rather directly, though these corrections have taken considerably longer to reach popular awareness than the original mythology did. Several interviews conducted with aging former trappers in the later 1800s specifically address, sometimes with visible irritation, the gap between how they were being portrayed in popular fiction and how they remembered actually living. One elderly former trapper reportedly telling an interviewer that the writers back east had turned men who mostly worried about wet feet and empty stomachs into figures who apparently spent every waking hour fighting bears and outrunning war parties, a distortion he found more exhausting to correct than flattering to hear repeated. This kind of first-hand pushback against an already calcifying myth offers a valuable reminder that history and popular memory frequently diverge not through any single dramatic falsification, but through countless small choices about which details a storyteller finds interesting enough to keep and which quieter, more difficult truths simply don't survive the editing process. There remains even now genuine scholarly debate about how many trappers actually experience their working lives closer to Bill's version, defined by careful negotiation, patient skill, and constant adaptation, versus how many experienced something closer to the more violent, unpredictable existence popular fiction preferred and honest historians. Studying this question tend to acknowledge that the surviving written record disproportionately produced by literate company men missionaries and later interviewers rather than by ordinary working trappers themselves almost certainly skews our understanding in ways we can only partially correct for at this historical distance. What seems reasonably clear, weighing the available evidence as carefully as current scholarship allows, is that survival depended overwhelmingly on exactly the kind of patient accumulated, often quietly negotiated knowledge we've traced together this evening. Fire and shelter and hide and river and sign and season knowledge, built collaboratively across cultures rather than conquered in isolation, and that this quieter truth, however less immediately thrilling than the dime novel version, carries a weight and a dignity entirely its own. As the young trapper stands now at the edge of that crowded rendezvous valley, Pelt secured a season of hard-won knowledge, settling into something closer to permanent instinct within him. The story that began with a single cold morning and a snap twig in the darkness is drawing gently toward its own quiet conclusion, one that has less to do with danger finally passing and more to do with what a person carries forward once they've learned to see a world that most people never truly notice at all. The written record we've been leaning on throughout this evening, letters later, interviews, company ledgers, exists in far scarcer supply than most people assume, and understanding exactly how thin that supply actually is changes how we should hold everything we think we know about men like Bill and the young trapper travelling beside him. The overwhelming majority of trappers during the fur trade era could not read or write at all, which means the vast bulk of frontier experience, the accumulated knowledge of fire and hide and river and sign we've spent this entire evening tracing, existed, and then vanished entirely within living memory, never once committed to paper by the people who actually lived it. What survives instead comes down to us through a remarkably small handful of literate exceptions, men who happen to combine genuine trapping experience with the habit unusual for their profession of keeping a written journal. One of the most valuable of these, and one considerably less famous than it deserves to be, belongs to a trapper named Osborne Russell, who spent much of the 1830s and early 1840s working in exactly the country our story moves through, and who kept a detailed, unusually observant journal throughout his years in the mountains, later published as a slim volume that historians of the fur trade still treat as one of their single most valuable primary sources. Russell's writing carries a plain, unpretentious quality that stands in sharp contrast to the embellished dime novel adventures being written about men like him during those same years back east, describing weather game movements, encounters with various indigenous nations, and the physical hardships of trapping life with a matter-of-fact clarity that reads, even now considerably more like a careful field notebook than anything resembling heroic legend. It's worth sitting with what this scarcity actually means for how confidently we can speak about frontier life in general. Historians studying this period are in an important sense working from an extremely narrow keyhole, a handful of literate voices standing in for many thousands of trappers whose actual daily experience, whose private fears, whose small triumphs and quiet losses left no trace whatsoever beyond perhaps a name in a company ledger, and eventually an unexplained absence from the following year's gathering. Composite figures like the ones we've followed tonight are built specifically to acknowledge this gap, honestly drawing on the patterns visible across Russell's journal, across company records, across the later interviews conducted with aging survivors, rather than claiming to represent any single fully documented individual life. It is genuinely humbling when you sit with this. How much of this remarkable body of human knowledge simply disappeared along with the people who carried it unrecorded? Not because it lacked value, but because the people who possessed it were almost without exception too busy surviving to write any of it down. What these scarce written sources do make unusually clear, though, is just how physically punishing this life actually was on the body over time, in ways that went well beyond the dramatic dangers of grisly encounters or river crossings that popular retellings tend to emphasize. Chronic joint pain from years of sleeping on frozen ground, damaged eyesight from prolonged exposure to campfire smoke and relentless glare off snow-missing fingers and toes from frostbite that never fully heal. These appear again and again in the fragmentary medical observations recorded by missionaries and company physicians who occasionally encountered trappers passing through more established outposts. Medicine itself, in any formal sense, was almost entirely absent from the mountains. A serious injury, a broken bone, a deep wound gone septic, a bout of what trappers commonly called mountain fever, likely a form of tick-borne illness that modern physicians would probably recognize today. Though it should be said that the exact medical nature of many frontier-era ailments remains genuinely difficult to diagnose. Retroactively from vague period descriptions had to be managed with whatever combination of indigenous herbal knowledge, rough field surgery and sheer physical endurance a trapper and his companions could improvise on the spot. Amputation, when it happened at all, was performed with a knife whiskey, serving as the only available anesthetic, and survival afterward depended almost entirely on whether infection could somehow be avoided in conditions offering no meaningful way to maintain it. Given this reality, it becomes worth asking honestly how any given trapper actually weighed the decision to keep returning to the mountain season after season, knowing what they by then clearly understood about the physical toll accumulating in their own bodies and in the bodies of the men around them. Russell's journal, along with the surviving accounts of several other literate trappers, suggests an answer that resists easy sentimentality in either direction. Neither purely heroic embrace of hardship nor simple economic desperation, but something closer to a genuinely mixed accounting men who understood precisely what continuing to trap was costing them physically, and who continued anyway for reasons that varied considerably from person-to-person debt in some cases, habit and identity in others, and in a good number of documented instances, something that reads very much like an authentic, freely chosen preference for this life over the alternative waiting for them back east, however much that life was visibly wearing their bodies down. The formal end of this particular chapter of American frontier history arrived with less drama than its beginning, fading rather than collapsing in a way that mirrors how quietly the underlying economics had already been shifting for years beforehand. By the summer of 1840, attendance at the annual rendezvous had thinned noticeably compared to gatherings from just a few years earlier, beaver prices having fallen so far that many former trapping outfits had already redirected their operations elsewhere or dissolved entirely. That particular rendezvous, gathered once more along the Green River, is generally regarded by historians as the last of the truly major gatherings in the classic mountain man tradition. Those smaller, less formal trading meetings continued in sattered form for some years afterward, and it would be an overstatement to suggest the entire trapping economy simply switched off in a single season. Still, something genuinely significant closed that year, a particular scale of gathering, a particular density of trappers converging annually on one remote valley that would never quite be repeated in the same form again. Several trappers present that summer are recorded in second-hand accounts collected decades later as having sensed even then that they were witnessing something ending. An atmosphere one aging survivor described to an interviewer as feeling less like a celebration and more like a wake, though we should hold that specific recollection with appropriate caution since it was recorded so many years after the fact and may well have been coloured by the interviewee's knowledge by that point of exactly how the story had turned out. What happened to the men who had built their entire adult identity around this particular way of life varied enormously in the years that followed, and tracing those individual threads offers a useful corrective to any temptation to treat the end of the fur trade as a single clean historical boundary line. Some, as we discussed earlier, transitioned into guiding the wagon trains beginning to move west in growing numbers, their mountain knowledge repurposed for an entirely new economic and historical moment. Others drifted into more isolated existences, entirely disconnected from any formal economy, living quietly at the margins of the expanding settlements, occasionally surfacing in later historical accounts only because a curious traveller or early ethnographer happened to seek them out specifically to ask what the old days had actually been like. A smaller number achieved a kind of lasting individual fame, men like Kit Carson, whose later career as a guide soldier and eventually a figure of considerable controversy in the ongoing conflicts between the United States government and indigenous nations, complicates any attempt to view the mountain man legacy through a single uncomplicated lens, since the same skills of wilderness navigation and cross-cultural fluency that had once made diplomatic survival possible were in later decades sometimes redirected toward considerably darker purposes entirely. This complexity matters, and it would be a disservice to the actual historical record to smooth it away in service of a tidier story. The skills we've spent this entire evening tracing patient, humble, deeply collaborative knowledge, born from genuine respect for both the land and the peoples who had always known it existed alongside a wider colonial project that would, in the coming decades, use very similar knowledge in service of considerably more violent and dispossessive ends. Bill and the young trapper in our own composite story represent the earlier, more individually intimate texture of this world. Two men negotiating survival through careful attention and mutual respect rather than conquest, but it is worth holding gently and honestly the fact that the wider historical current surrounding their particular moment would soon carry the American frontier toward chapters considerably less gentle than the one we've spent tonight exploring. And so as the last light fades from that Green River Valley, in the summer of 1840, as trappers scatter in every direction toward futures, none of them could have fully predicted the story we've been following all evening, arrives finally at the question that has been quietly waiting beneath everything else. What exactly survived from all of this, carried forward not through any single dramatic act of preservation, but through the countless small, patient choices of people determined that this particular way of understanding the world should not simply disappear along with the men who first learned to live inside it? An answer, or at least the beginning of one, comes from a place that has nothing to do with the mountains at all, and everything to do with what happens when knowledge nearly disappears and then unexpectedly finds its way back into the world through people who were never trappers themselves. Among the more remarkable threads in this preservation story is the role played by indigenous communities who, of course, never actually lost this knowledge in the first place, since so much of what we have spent this evening describing originated with them and continued to be practiced within their own communities long after the trapping economy that borrowed it had collapsed entirely. This point deserves to be stated plainly, because popular accounts of frontier survival skills have a persistent tendency to frame this knowledge as something that vanished and had to be heroically rediscovered, when the more accurate picture is that it never vanished at all within the communities of origin. It simply stopped being visible to the wider American public, which had for generations paid remarkably little attention to indigenous knowledge systems, except when convenient to extract from them. In recent decades, a growing number of tribal cultural preservation programs working in various forms of partnership with historian museums and sometimes with the descendants of trapper families themselves have played a crucial role in correcting the historical record, insisting accurately that skills like brain tanning, pemmican preparation, and sign language communication be properly credited to their origins, rather than folded anonymously into a generic frontier mythology that too often obscured exactly whose knowledge was actually being used. There is a particular irony worth noting here, one that connects directly back to something we touched on earlier in this story. The same castoreum that trappers once harvested from beaver glands to bait their steel traps, the substance whose faintly sweet leathery scent still occasionally appears in perfume formulations today, has recently become the subject of renewed scientific interest for reasons that would have struck a trapper like Bill as almost unbelievable. Researchers studying beaver biology in recent years have found that castoreum contains compounds derived partly from the plants beaver consume, some of which include naturally occurring salicin, chemically related to the active compound in aspirin, a substance beaver themselves seem to accumulate simply through their diet of willow bark and similar plant material. This doesn't mean trappers were harvesting some kind of miracle medicine from beaver glands, and it would be an overstatement to suggest otherwise. But it does mean that a substance handled purely as practical trapping bait for well over a century has quite unexpectedly become a small footnote in modern pharmacological research, one more example of how frequently frontier knowledge and modern science turn out to be circling the same underlying truths from very different directions, separated by nothing more than the vocabulary available to describe what was being observed. The primitive skills movement that emerged more formally in the latter half of the 20th century represents another significant thread in how this knowledge found its way back into wider circulation. Beginning particularly in the 1970s and gaining considerable momentum in the decades since a growing community of wilderness educators, many of them working directly with Indigenous knowledge keepers to ensure proper attribution and accuracy, began teaching flint and steel fire making, heat tanning, primitive shelter construction and related skills not as historical curiosity, but as genuinely practical outdoor education offered through schools, wilderness programs, and eventually a considerable body of published instructional material. Some of the most rigorous of these programs have gone so far as to require students to actually survive extended periods using only these techniques, no modern equipment whatsoever. A level of hands-on verification that has done more than any written history alone could to confirm that these frontier-era methods genuinely work as described rather than existing only as romanticized legend softened by generations of retelling. What emerges from this modern testing, interestingly, is a body of evidence suggesting that some frontier claims long treated with mild historical skepticism actually hold up remarkably well under careful scrutiny, while others require meaningful correction. The flint and steel fire-making process, for instance, has been repeatedly and reliably reproduced by modern practitioners under genuinely difficult conditions, wet weather, extreme cold, confirming that surviving accounts were describing a real teachable, physically demanding skill rather than something exaggerated for effect. The claim that beaver tail was considered a genuine delicacy similarly has been corroborated by modern practitioners who have prepared it using period-appropriate methods and found the fat content and flavor profile largely consistent with historical description. Other claims prove somewhat harder to verify with full confidence, particularly around the more informal folk wisdom concerning weather prediction and animal behavior, since these depended so heavily on highly localized accumulated pattern recognition specific to particular trappers and particular stretches of terrain, that modern practitioners working in different locations and without decades of continuous local observation simply cannot always replicate the same predictive accuracy, a limitation that honest instructors in this field are generally quite careful to acknowledge rather than paper over. This careful, patient work of testing and preserving frontier survival knowledge connects to something larger and in its own quiet way, genuinely moving, which is the growing recognition among historians and educators alike that this body of knowledge represents something considerably more valuable than mere historical curiosity or entertainment. It represents at its core a fundamentally different relationship between a person and their environment than most of us carry today, one built on sustained attention rather than distraction, on patient observation rather than assumption, on genuine humility toward forces considerably larger than any single individual. The specific technical skills how to strike flint at precisely the right angle, how to soften a hide with brain matter, how to read a river's subtle surface for hidden danger matter, enormously in their own right, but they matter perhaps even more as evidence of a way of moving through the world that modern life, for all its genuine comforts and conveniences, has left most of us considerably less practiced at maintaining. It is worth asking gently without any need for an answer delivered with false certainty what it might mean to carry even a small fragment of that attentiveness into an ordinary evening, centuries removed from any beaver stream, noticing more carefully the weather, building outside a window, the particular quality of silence in a familiar room, the small easily overlooked signs that something in a person or a place has quietly shifted. This is not a claim that modern comfort should be traded for frontier hardship, nor any suggestion that the genuine dangers this story has traced tonight were anything but real and often fatal. It is simply an observation that the deepest lesson embedded in all of this hard-won knowledge may have less to do with mountains and beaver pelt specifically, and considerably more to do with the quality of attention a person brings to wherever they happen to be standing. As this long evening, in the company of Bill and his young apprentice, draws now toward its final resting place, it seems fitting to turn at last toward the quiet closing thought. This entire story has been gathering toward all along the kind of thought best carried gently into whatever rest waits on the other side of it. There is one final piece of evidence worth setting before you, and it comes not from a journal or a company ledger, but from the ground itself. In the 1990s, archaeologists working a confirmed rendezvous site in western Wyoming uncovered something small and easy to overlook: a cluster of trade beads, a scattering of gun flints and pressed into the soil beneath decades of grass and weather, the faint circular impression of a shelter frame, the exact size and shape of a half-faced camp. No name accompanied it, no date more precise than a decade's window. Just the outline of where a person once slept, close enough to a bit still faintly visible in the changed colour of the earth. Whoever built that shelter left no other trace of themselves as anywhere in the historical record. And yet here it was nearly 200 years later, still legible to those who knew how to read it, a shape in the dirt that once meant the difference between a warm night and a fatal one, that in the end is what this entire evening has really been about. Not the names we happen to remember, Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger, John Jacob Astor, but the thousands upon thousands of ordinary people whose names we don't, whose entire hard-won understanding of how to survive in an unforgiving world left behind at best a shelter outline in the soil, and at worst nothing at all beyond an absence at the following summer's gathering. We began tonight with a young trapper waking to a snapped twig in the pre-dawn dark, uncertain whether that sound meant danger or simply the ordinary movement of an ordinary morning. We followed him and his mentor through a season that asked everything of them. Fire coaxed from stone in a snowstorm, a hide softened with the very brain of the animal. It came from a boat built from willow and deerskin to cross a river that should not have been crossable at all. We watched them read a landscape that offered no maps, negotiate with strangers through gesture rather than shared language, and carry forward knowledge, borrowed gratefully and often silently from the indigenous nations who had already mastered this land many generations before either of them was born. And underneath all of it we found something that deserves to be named plainly. This was never really a story about one man's toughness. It was a story about inheritance, about knowledge passed hand to hand, because the alternative was for it to simply disappear. It is worth sitting gently with how much of it actually did disappear. Most trappers could neither read nor write, which means the overwhelming majority of what they knew left this world the moment they did. unrecorded, unremarked, folded quietly back into the same wilderness that had taught it to them. What survives comes down to us through the narrowest of openings. A handful of literate exceptions like Osborne Russell, a scattering of interviews conducted decades later with men who were by then old and often reluctant to speak a few thousand company ledger entries listing pelts and debts rather than lives. History, we like to imagine, remembers what matters. More often, history remembers only what happened to be written down, and the two are not nearly the same thing. And yet something did survive, carried forward in ways that would have surprised the trappers themselves. The indigenous communities who originated so much of this knowledge, brain tanning, pemmican sign language, the deep reading of river and season, never actually lost it in the first place, continuing to practice and refine it long after the fur trade that borrowed it had collapsed into irrelevance. Modern wilderness instructors, working sometimes in careful partnership with tribal knowledge, keepers have spent recent decades testing these old techniques against real conditions, confirming hand-blistered and smoke-stung that the accounts were not exaggeration but simple hard fact. And ecologists studying watersheds that had run dry for a century after the beaver vanished have begun reintroducing the very animal whose pursuit once defined this entire era. Watching wetlands rebuild themselves slowly, almost as if the land itself remembered what it was supposed to look like. There is a pattern in all of this worth naming before we close, because it is not unique to trappers or to beaver or to the particular decades of the 1820s and 1830s. It is a pattern that repeats across nearly every chapter of human history. Wherever people have needed to survive somewhere, the modern world has not yet reached or is already left behind. Power concentrates in distant cities while risk concentrates in distant wilderness. Whether that wilderness is a frozen river valley or a factory floor or a besieged town, most of us will never visit. Fortunes rise from labor whose cost is paid almost entirely by people who never see the fortune itself. Fashion changes in cities, and quietly an entire way of life 1,000 miles away buckles beneath the shift. Knowledge accumulates for a generation or two through nothing but hard consequence and careful attention, and then, unless someone makes the deliberate choice to carry it forward, it simply stops existing on as completely as if it had never been true at all. None of this is unique to the American frontier. It is simply quietly how history tends to move, whether we are watching closely enough to notice or not. What feels different sitting with this particular story is the dignity that runs underneath its hardship, a dignity that has nothing to do with fame or fortune and everything to do with the quality of attention two people brought to an impossibly demanding world. Bill teaching a greenhorn how to strike a spark in falling snow, a trapper offering trade beads instead of gunfire, because he understood correctly that most encounters could be resolved through patience rather than force. A young man softened by city life, learning slowly that survival was never really about domination, about conquering a hostile wilderness through sheer will, but about listening closely enough to a place that it would eventually allow you to stay. Beaver, we now understand with a precision no trapper possessed, quietly held entire ecosystems together, their dams slowing water, building soil-sheltering species that depended on wetlands most people never think to notice. Their near disappearance reshaped watersheds across an entire half of a continent invisibly. Gradually, over the very same decades, trappers were reading rivers for danger and setting traps along their banks. And their return in recent years to streams that had gone silent for 100 years offers something rare in stories about resource collapse, a genuine documented instance of a landscape healing once the missing piece was simply allowed back in. Perhaps that is close to the truest thing this story has to offer. Loss in history is rarely final in the way it feels in the moment. Knowledge fades, but sometimes it is found again in an old journal, in an elder's careful teaching, in the patient hands of someone willing to strike flint against steel 100 times until the spark finally catches. Ecosystems collapse, but sometimes given enough time and enough humility, they find their way back towards something like their original shape, and the people who live through the hardest of it, the ones whose names we will never know, whose only remaining trace might be a faint circular impression in Wyoming soil, mattered anyway. Their skill mattered, their patience mattered, whether or not anyone ever wrote it down. The mountains themselves do not remember Bill or the young trapper beside him, or any of the 150 souls gathered that final summer along the Green River. Mountains do not keep names, but something of what those people knew: how to read water, how to soften a hide, how to carry enough fat and dried meat to survive a storm, with no name and no mercy, drifted forward anyway, thread by thread, into hands that would never meet theirs, into a present neither of them could have imagined. It is late now wherever you are. The fire in this story has long since burned down to coals. Somewhere in Wyoming, under grass that has grown back 150 times since anyone last slept there, the faint outline of a shelter still holds its shape in the soil, waiting for no one, remembered by no one, and yet still there, patient, quiet, exactly where it was left. That is how most of history actually survives. Not in monuments, not in names, in small physical traces that outlast the people who made them, and in the quieter inheritance carried forward by anyone willing to learn what those traces still have to teach. The wilderness that swallowed so many names swallowed also in its own way something gentler than we usually give it credit for, a kind of attention, a kind of patience, the simple hard-earned knowledge that survival was never really a solitary act at all. Somewhere above that old Green River Valley tonight, the same stars that once guided a lost trapper home are still turning slow and steady around a point in the northern sky that has not moved in all this time. Rest well.